Well, welcome to the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Here's what's coming up in the half hour. Following the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, Israeli troops retreat to the Yellow Line. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres welcomes the ceasefire, calling it a desperately needed breakthrough. Plus, Palestinians have begun returning to Gaza as Israel and Hamas agree a ceasefire, part of the Trump Gaza plan. Israeli forces pulled back to the Yellow Lines, agreed under Trump's plan, but says they will continue to remove any immediate threat. Hamas has until noon local time to release all the Israeli hostages by Monday, while Israel will release hundreds of Palestinian detainees. Armed Hamas security forces have deployed in the streets of Gaza in the areas from which Israel withdrew. They're filling a security vacuum because of the details of who will run Gaza, which has still not been decided. In the meantime, aid agencies say they are on standby to flood Gaza with aid, but it remains unclear just how involved they will be. All agencies say they have supplies standing by and are ready to go in immediately, with the WHO saying the task ahead is immense. Take a look at those returning to Gaza. A lot of them say that they have been displaced multiple times since the war began. So as soon as a ceasefire deal was announced, they got ready to return home again. Much of the overall damage in Gaza has been concentrated in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. It suffered heavy bombardments, and much of the area fell under Israeli military control and evacuation orders. This included Gaza City, the most populated part of the region. It also suffered the most destruction. Meanwhile, both Israel and Hamas have released the names of hostages and prisoners expected to be released on Monday. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned his country is not yet finished in Gaza. In a televised address earlier today, he told Israelis, 2 years ago, we embarked on a campaign and retaliated against our enemies. Thanks to your resilience and unity, citizens of Israel, we withstand difficult tests. We achieved tremendous victories that are changing the face of the Middle East. But as the Chief of Staff said, the campaign is not yet finished. Great challenges, he says, still lie ahead of us, but also opportunities. Netanyahu added that his military operations had trapped Hamas, saying that they cornered them from all sides in preparation for the next stages of the plan, where Hamas will be disarmed and then dismantled. It comes after the Israeli Defense Forces announced earlier today the ceasefire was in effect. The Israeli cabinet approved the first phase of the Gaza peace deal on Thursday evening. It covers a ceasefire, the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, as well as an Israeli withdrawal to the Yellow Line, a boundary limit within Gaza. Staying with the ceasefire and developments in Gaza, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has welcomed the announcement of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, calling it a desperately needed breakthrough. Speaking to reporters in New York Thursday evening, Guterres commended the diplomatic efforts of the United States, of Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey in brokering the desperately needed breakthrough. He reiterated that the UN will provide its full support for the agreement.
I welcome the announcement last night of an agreement to secure a ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza, based on the proposal put forward by President Donald J. Trump. And I commend the diplomatic efforts of the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey in brokering the desperately needed breakthrough. We have all waited far too long for this moment. Now we must make it truly count. I urge all parties to fully abide by the terms of the agreement and to fully embrace the opportunities it presents. All hostages must be released in a dignified manner. A permanent ceasefire must be secured. The bloodshed must stop once and for all. And the United Nations will provide its full support. We and our partners are prepared to move now. We have the expertise, the distribution networks, the community relationships in place to act. Supplies are in place and our teams are on standby. We can scale up food, water, medical and shelter assistance at once. But to turn this ceasefire into real progress, we need more than the silencing of the guns. We need full, safe and sustained access for humanitarian workers, the removal of red tape and impediments, and the rebuilding of shattered infrastructure. And we need member states to ensure that humanitarian operations are properly funded to meet the immense needs. We must never forget the unbearable human cost of this conflict. I mourn all of the lives lost, including United Nations personnel and humanitarian workers, and pay tribute to our colleagues who continue to serve with courage and compassion in conditions of extreme risk. For Israelis and Palestinians alike, this deal offers a glimmer of relief. And that glimmer must become the dawn of peace, the beginning of the end of this devastating war. I urge all to seize this momentous opportunity to establish a credible political path forward.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. France's political crisis shows no sign of abating. The resignation of Sébastien Lecornu as Prime Minister this week, after just 27 days in office, means the country is set to have an 8th Prime Minister in the space of 5 years. For more on the political crisis and what it means for the wider EU, we're joined by Arthur Sullivan from the DW. Arthur, great to have you on the program. Why is France so politically unstable at the moment?
Well, what's been happening for the past year is that they've been muddling on. So it is possible, of course, that a new government will be named, a new prime minister will be named, there won't be fresh elections, and they'll just keep sort of lurching forward to the next crisis. But in reality, that's all just a sticking plaster. What France needs, clearly, is a stable government capable of actually dealing with its debt and fiscal issues, of reforming them, and ideally one that works in lockstep with the president. But what's happening as this instability goes on and as the president becomes more undermined, it's benefiting that right-wing National Front who clearly lead opinion polls, not just for the parliament elections, but also for the next presidential election. Now, they would obviously not work well with Macron in parliament. They're diametrically opposed politically, but they claim they would bring stability. Now, of course, their supporters heartily believe that, but many would argue strongly with that across France, as although they are the leading party in opinion polls, they're also wildly unpopular across the country, and many see them as a divisive political force. Now, as for Macron, his term doesn't end as president until May 2027. It's hard to see how he would be leaving before that. But politicians across the political divide, not just from the right wing, but including some of his allies, have actually said there should be a presidential election much sooner than 2027 to try and resolve this crisis. And if Macron can't forge a stable government soon, that pressure and that talk about early elections is only going to grow.
But what is at stake for the economy and the wider EU economy?
Well, all this political instability means that France is simply not in a position to deal with some serious underlying fundamental fiscal problems. So the bottom line, France is in debt, big time. Now, culturally, it has never been famed for balancing its budgets, and certainly not under the presidency of Emmanuel Macron. It's gotten more pronounced under him since he took office in 2017. Government spending has been increasing dramatically, and yet with tax cuts, the government hasn't been taking in enough to try and match that spending. And so its budget deficit keeps getting bigger. And as well as that, France now has the third highest debt to GDP ratio in Europe, which is a typical measure of a country's debt relative to its growth. But it's not only not getting dealt with. It's actually getting worse. So ratings agencies are warning about the risks of the country that's so big, with such a big economy, in this kind of debt. French borrowing costs are going up, and there is growing anxiety about just how unprepared France would be to deal with a potential financial crisis, and how contagion could arise in the event of a debt crisis. Now, memories are still very fresh across the EU of the euro sovereign debt crisis, which happened in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in the early 2010s. And when you've got an economy as big as France's is in this position, then obviously the whole EU has reason to worry, because if things got bad in France, they would very quickly get bad elsewhere.
I can imagine. Arthur, is there any prospect of an end to the crisis, though? Is the French president's position under threat at the moment?
So this instability all goes back to the fateful decision made last summer by the French President Emmanuel Macron to call snap parliamentary elections. So just a quick explainer on the French political system. In that system, the president and the parliament are separate. They're elected in separate elections. There's the executive branch of the president, the legislative branch of the parliament. But last summer, Macron got spooked by the strong and increasingly strong performance of his great rival, Marine Le Pen's right-wing National Front Party. They performed well in European elections, and in the aftermath of that, he decided to call sudden parliamentary elections, and he very clearly cast them as a decisive vote for the French people to either give his centrist coalition in Parliament a clearer mandate or to fully embrace the right. But the thing is, in a divided country and a divided parliament, neither of those things happened, and the election left the parliament even more divided than it was before, with no one bloc strong enough to govern. And so since then, there's been this instability. 4 different prime ministers, soon to be 5. Budgets have not been passed. Legislative progress has been almost impossible. Disagreements over government formation, disagreements over small things, a lack of cohesion, and in effect, chaos has been reigning in the French political system.
Well, a lot to clean up there, Arthur. Thanks again for the explainer. The Philippines' southern coast has been hit by a 7.4 magnitude earthquake, prompting tsunami warnings from Philippines and Indonesian authority. Residents in coastal towns in central and southern Philippines were asked to evacuate as authorities warned of waves over a meter above normal tide levels. At least one person was killed in the earthquake this morning, which also led to power cuts and classes being suspended in parts of the country. The latest tremor comes just over a week after a 6.9 magnitude earthquake hit the Philippines' central Cebu province, killing 74 people and injuring hundreds more. The Philippines, which sits on the geologically unstable ring of fire, has been reeling from a string of devastating natural disasters. The Nobel Prize Committee has announced Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Machado winner of this year's Peace Prize. The 58-year-old was hailed by the Nobel Committee as one of the most extraordinary examples of civilian courage in Latin America in recent times, and praised her for tireless work promoting democratic rights for the people of Venezuela. For years, she's campaigned against Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro, whose 12-year-old rule is viewed by many nations as illegitimate. Among those who missed out on the Nobel Peace Prize was US President Donald Trump, who's made no secret about his desire to get the prestigious award, with multiple public overtures on the 7 wars he claims to have ended. Nominations for the award closed in January. A White House official responded by saying the Nobel Committee proved they place politics over peace.
We congratulate Maria Corina Machado on being announced as the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. This recognition reflects the clear aspirations of the people of Venezuela for free and fair elections, for civil and political rights, and for the rule of law. The High Commissioner has consistently spoken out in support of these values. Reiterates this willingness of our office to engage in good faith with the government of Venezuela and all the stakeholders based on mutual respect. And we remain firmly committed to continue working to defend and protect the human rights of all Venezuelans, whether they are in Venezuela or abroad, and based, of course, on information and with the victims in the center of our work.
Staying in Latin America, President of Peru, Dina Boluarte, has been removed from office after the Congress voted in a late-night session following a debate over her impeachment. An overwhelming majority of lawmakers from across the political spectrum approved her ousting on grounds of permanent moral incapacity. A total of 122 out of 130 lawmakers voted for Boluarte's removal earlier today, following votes resoundingly in favor of 4 motions of impeachment. Congress leader Jose Jerry was sworn in as interim president soon after the removal. Peru does not currently have a vice president. In an address on national television following the vote, Boluarte questioned the implications it would have on the stability of Peru's democracy. One of the world's most unpopular leaders, with an approval rating of 2 to 4%, Boluarte's tenure has been plagued by frequent protests, scandals, and investigations, as well as a surge in gang violence. Belgian police have arrested 3 people suspected of plotting an attack on the country's Prime Minister, Bart de Wever. The alleged plot was described by prosecutors as a jihadist-inspired terrorist attack on the Prime Minister and other politicians. Authorities found a suspected improvised explosive device and evidence the suspects were planning to use a drone during searches in Deurne, Antwerp, close to the Prime Minister's private residence. The intended targets of the attack were not named by the prosecutor's office, but Deputy Prime Minister Maxime Prévost said de Wever was among them. Flemish reports later suggested that Antwerp Mayor Els van Doesburg may also have been targeted. Dutch anti-Islam leader Geert Wilders decided not to take part in an election debate on Dutch radio because of reports he too may have been a target. New York Attorney General Letitia James has been indicted on charges of alleged fraud, becoming the second political figure in a span of 2 weeks to face prosecution after President Donald Trump's public demand that the Justice Department move now to charge his political enemies. James, who successfully brought a civil fraud case against Trump last year and leads multiple lawsuits challenging his administration's policies, was indicted on a federal charge of bank fraud and a charge of making false statements to a financial institution. The newly appointed U.S. Attorney General for the Eastern District of Virginia, Lindsay Halligan, announced the charges on Thursday. James was ordered to appear in court on October 24 in Norfolk, Virginia. Halligan was named U.S. Attorney by Trump after Trump ousted her predecessor, Eric Siebert, who sources say had expressed doubts internally about bringing cases against James and former FBI Director James Comey. And as we end the program, Korea's largest drone light show, Poncheon Hantagan World Drone Festival, has kicked off with a dazzling US-themed show over the Hantan River. We're looking at thousands of drones illuminating the night sky, forming iconic symbols from the US, such as the Statue of Liberty, a bald eagle, a football player, and a King Kong atop the Empire State Building. Those breathtaking display drew hundreds of spectators along the riverside. One of them said once he saw the drone show, it was absolutely amazing. Just being able to see it in person made him really happy. Another said seeing the drone show with figures like the Statue of Liberty and a football player was really fascinating and fun. More than 6,000 drones are expected to be featured at the 2025 Poncheon Hantan River World Drone Festival. It runs from October 9th to the 12th. That's the world today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.